Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about something I saw come up in the comments a while back. Someone had said, Jason, why are you doing your box squats so wide? You're basically just turning it into a reverse sumo deadlift, which I kind of laughed at because they acted as if there's something wrong with that. They acted as if there's something wrong with that. And here's the thing that I try to point out to people, and I think these two lifts highlight it the best. Right? They highlight it the best. That squatting versus hip hinging, which again, all deadlifts count as a hip hinge, are a continuum. Okay? It's a continuum. It's a spectrum with a deep ass to grass squat being on one end and something like a super strict good morning or Romanian deadlift being on the other end as a pure hip hinge if you have the knees almost completely locked. And it's something I try to explain to people that that's the biggest difference between a squat and a hip hinge are the degrees of knee flexion. Right? That's the big difference because all squats are a hip hinge. And when we start looking at something like the sumo deadlift versus a wide stance box squat, they start to turn into very, very similar movements, don't they? The only difference is on the box squat, we might be going deeper, but what if you take it to a high box? What if you're someone whose mobility is a little different and you drop hips lower on the sumo? Then they essentially start turning into almost an identical movement. Right? They turn into almost identical movements. Really, the biggest difference here is still range of motion, but where's that range of motion coming from? Where's that range of motion coming from? Purely from the knees, right? Because I'm doing these on the camera below parallel and my hips are higher on the sumo. The biggest difference is one of them has an eccentric and the other really doesn't. One is a concentric base, but they are both coming from a dead stop. They're essentially similar movements though, aren't they? And I think, again, this really highlights the difference. And it's one of the reasons I always laugh when people bring up stuff like, oh, well, the trap bar deadlift is like a squat. No, it's not. Trap bar deadlift is nothing like a squat. It's not even remotely squat-like on that hip hinge continuum compared to even a sumo deadlift, right? It's ridiculous. It's ludicrous. And again, that's another side topic. But it is slightly squattier than a conventional deadlift, yes, by a couple degrees. But it's all about the amount of knee involvement. Because the only difference here we're seeing with the sumo ones, but what would happen if we did them top down? What happened if we did them as a Romanian sumo deadlift? It would be even closer to the box squat. It would be even closer. So here's the thing to look at these movements. We're seeing a very, very similar movement pattern. So much so that they train each other, right? They train each other. In fact, when you do these with a safety bar, which again puts more back involvement, box squats, wide stance box squats with a safety bar are one of the best sumo deadlift builders you can do. Now you do them with any stance and they're one of the best deadlift builders. Because it builds the lower body similar to a squat, but we have a dead stop, but then we get more back involvement, particularly upper back because of that bar. The carryover is even better, again due to the development, the movement patterns. Okay. They train each other. You know, it would make this even more sumo-like. What if we took it to a higher box? Instead of that 12-inch box I'm using there, what if I added another 4 inches, took it up to 16, 17, 18? Then it would really look like the sumos, wouldn't it? How much would that train? How much would that train the sumo deadlift? It would have direct carryover. In fact, again, because of the movement pattern carryover, if someone wanted to deadlift specialize, and they didn't care about their squat at all, they could do nothing but high sumo style stance box squats, like that wide stance with a safety bar. And that would build both deadlifts, wouldn't it? Right? Because a sumo builds a conventional. You just need a little more back training to go with it. So if someone wanted to be a deadlift specialist, doing all their speed squats off of a high box, wide stance with that bar, well, arguably they could do narrow stance too to carry over to conventional. They could rotate it. Could absolutely do that. And they could specialize in the deadlift that way because the movements are similar. It's just like I've shown you guys in the past, box squatting versus good mornings, right? A relatively wide stance on a good morning versus a not super wide stance on a box squat. I've shown them side by side for maxes. They're the same movement. The only difference is the amount of knee flexion. All right, the hip extension is identical. Hip extension is identical. And when you look at it and understand that, it also makes sense of when you see the best coaches and the best researchers try to tell people that squats are not as quad dominant as people think they are. Squats are not even the best quad builders. You know, you'll get people who argue that. They'll say, oh, look at Olympic lifters. They all have big quads. They don't have the biggest quads in the world. They all have big quads. Most of them do. But do they have the biggest quads in the world? No. Not compared to bodybuilders. I mean, let's just call it like it is. What are you going to argue, drugs and genetics there? Now, granted, there'd be more drugs. Going to argue that? Okay, you can if you want. You can argue that point. But Olympic lifters who are at the Olympics are all on drugs and they're all genetic freaks. They still have smaller quads than most bodybuilders. But I digress over to the point. The best coaches know to build the hip extensors to build your squat. The research shows that even for Olympic style high bar squats, right, the hip extensor activation and hypertrophy is more so than in the quads. So what does that tell you? It tells you that quads are important, right? They're important, but not as important as hip extensors. What's going to give you the most bang for your buck for getting a stronger squat? I think we could make an argument for focusing on the adductors. You really want a big squat, build your adductors. Your quads will be along for the ride anyways. If you're doing squatting, even box squatting or whatever, and you're able to lift more weight because you built your adductors and glutes, your quads are going to get more stimulus anyways. You know, and if people really want to think that squats build big quads, then your argument becomes moot about worrying about quads then, because anything that makes your squat go up should make your quads grow. In theory. I'm not saying I always ascribe to that logic because I don't. I think we should always train weak links. But the odds that your quads are the weak link in your squat is not really that high. It exists in some cases. The majority it doesn't. It's usually posterior chain, some type. Adductors, your low back, right? Usually your weak links. 9 out of 10 times. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.